All right, Mr. Chair, you are live.
Welcome to the November 17th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting. I call the meeting to order, and can we do the roll call, please, Kimberly?
Mr. Klein,
Present?
Mr. Waldman,
Present.
Mr. Sale,
Here.
Ms. Butler,
Here.
Ms. Rubio Dorsey.
Present.
We have 5 present, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you very much. Let me share the agenda. Our agenda tonight, next up is the approval of minutes from September 15th that Kimberly had graciously resent around for everybody to review. Pretty simple in that on that meeting, there was just a work session. So I don't think I really have to show them. They're pretty simple.
I move to approve.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed or abstentions? Great, thank you very much. We can go ahead and publish those. Next up is public hearing for O-40-22 workforce housing for the purpose of allowing workforce housing as a permitted use subject to standards in certain residential, commercial, office, and mixed-use districts, establishing the standards for workforce housing and generally related to zoning, ZTA 2022-05. So if anybody wants to look this up on eTrackit, that's the number ZTA 2022-05. So to start, we're going to have as usual with these pieces of legislation, we'll have a report from staff. And I think also we're going to have a general presentation on workforce housing types from staff. So I think Eric Lashinsky, Chief of Comprehensive Planning, I guess is going to lead that off.
Yes, thank you, Chairman.
Take it away. Thanks.
All right. Eric Lashinsky, Chief of Comprehensive Planning. I'm here with other city staff, including Teresa Wellman, our Chief of Community Development, and Jackie Rouse, Senior Planner, and our Director, Michael Laplace, Director of Planning and Zoning, is also here. So everyone has received the staff report. I don't really want to go through everything in that. I'm actually more interested in providing a presentation that just kind of helps the commission and anyone else watching to understand how we got to a place where there's a need for the kind of legislation that you're reviewing tonight, O-40-22, which is aimed at creating more workforce housing. So let me share my screen here. I think this presentation will basically, I think it'll answer, it'll address a lot of what's in the staff report, and it may answer questions as well. So let me go to the beginning here. All right. So I think questions are fine along the way, but it's about 20 slides. I'm gonna try to get through it quickly. So this graphic has become really prolific within the planning world nationally. It's been replicated many times over. Many jurisdictions are using it to explain sort of increasing absence of certain housing types in their communities, which has become known as the missing middle. Missing middle housing types are those types of housing that are somewhere in between a single family detached house and a large mid-rise or high-rise, in some cases, apartment building. There's a whole range of housing types in the middle that many of which exist in Annapolis today, but would not be allowed by our current zoning. And these are housing types that are often critical to housing people on lower to moderate incomes. So what is workforce housing? A shot from downtown Annapolis that shows row houses that were once upon a time workforce housing. I just wanted to start with this image. It's important because it's really kind of a building block for the city. This type of modest row house, storefront at the ground level, apartment above, presumably, housing the shopkeeper. It was at the corner of Clay and Calvert Street. It was demolished to make way for the Whitmore Garage during urban renewal. It's important to acknowledge that the housing issues that the city is facing today didn't happen overnight. They've just been kind of a systematic, gradual shift over time through various policies and trends. And so we're kind of at a point now where we are trying to reverse many of these trends through policy changes. This I think of as one of the first planned workforce housing developments in the city. It was essentially military housing in Eastport.
Eric, can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
When was our zoning code, sort of as we know it, established? In the mid 70s?
Jackie, I think my guess would be the late 60s, but I actually do not know the best answer to that.
Okay.
The first comprehensive plan the city did was in 1962, and I think it was probably shortly after that so this is the precursor to Eastport Terrace, a public housing community in Eastport. These kind of modest houses were built for military workers building ships in the city. And this is kind of like what I think of as the first planned workforce housing. Today, we have a lot of housing in the city that people may not notice that are modest apartments that are affordable to people who are part of the workforce, meaning really anybody who works in the city but is on a more modest income. And you can see them, these types of apartments are embedded in almost every neighborhood in the city, particularly our most desirable, high-priced neighborhoods have many of these types of modest missing middle housing types. Some more examples you can see from downtown, particularly Eastport, Germantown, Homewood. And, I took some of these images from a website called Missing Middle Annapolis, which has been trying to make these types of housing types more visible to people and promote them as something that is really formed the character of the city we know today, but many of these are not conforming or could not be built today based on our zoning code. So, the question has come up in the past, when we talk about affordable housing or workforce housing, in the case of tonight, what are we talking about? I mean, in today's world, it's complex. There's a lot of different housing types today, and this chart I found is probably one of the most helpful to explain what we're talking about. It shows the sort of spectrum of affordable to less affordable housing. But the important thing to notice here, these black dots that show the AMI, that's your area median income. That's a metric that's used to qualify people for housing. How much are you earning? Where do you fit within the area's median income? Are you earning below the area median income or above? 80% of the area median income is exactly that, 80% of the region's area median income. It's a statistic that's kept by HUD. It's updated annually, I believe. For our region, it's about $106,000 for a household. So that's potentially two earners. I think the staff report had the 80% in there. And I think it was, I guess it comes out to about 75,000. So maybe 85,000. So you can see the low end, affordable, low incomes. This is where public housing, I have some images on the next slide that talk about what these kind of housing types look like. But basically the income range is broken up by, 80% of AMI or less is a kind of housing that can be publicly financed, meaning you can get tax credits from the state or federal government. Usually it's federal tax credits that come through the state. And you really can't build for housing from above the 80% area median income population. That's kind of a stipulation. Then you have the 80% to 120%. There's some modest potential public financing in that range, but not much. And that's really become the sort of missing middle income level, because the housing types aren't getting built for this demographic, partly because they can't pencil out in terms of getting, they need the subsidy from government sources. The land costs are too high. And so you end up with not a lot that's really priced for this missing middle demographic. And then above 120%, there's no federal or state subsidy, and it's really just market-based housing. But there might be some, depending on how the housing is designed, more units, smaller units, they might come in at a price point that is still affordable to somebody who's making less money. But really, when we're talking about affordable housing or workforce housing, we're focusing on housing below that's aimed at people earning less than 120% of the AMI. And these also take into account, rentals and for sale. You really, in Annapolis, there's very few for sale homes that are priced for somebody making below 120% AMI. We were thinking about trying to how to explain the types of affordable housing that exist in Annapolis, workforce housing. And I should say, affordable housing and workforce housing are somewhat synonymous. I think the reason why the legislation uses workforce housing is that it is representing the fact that we are trying to house a key demographic in the city, that is people who work in the city, who can't afford to live in the city, who then end up driving from farther distances away, which compounds other problems in the city, whether it's traffic, vehicle emissions, public health issues. And so it's important to know that part of the reason why this legislation is being put forward is we want more people who work in the city to live in the city. It will benefit broadly the public and the city at large. So these are kind of the three categories that we found kind of summarize workforce housing to you. Public housing, historically owned and managed by the Housing Authority of the City of Annapolis. Internally, as we discussed, HACA's properties today, some of them aren't managed by HACA. The land might still be owned by HACA. The buildings might be owned by a private entity, and the facility is managed. So Bloomsbury Square is still owned and managed by HACA. Some of their other properties, like Oberry Courts on Clay Street, which was renovated, I think, in 2015, 2016, that is owned and managed by Penrose. The new Wilbourn Estates, which replaced Newtown 20, is kind of that same model. So the property stays in public housing, but it's privately managed. So this maybe we should have said privately managed public housing. And for these, the income requirement is under 60% AMI. It's all generally publicly financed, but even that, I think there's more private financing that's starting to come into the picture. So that's really the thing that is really is very complicated. How these projects end up being financed is through a whole range of different sources. So this privately developed subsidized housing, this is the Town Courts project recently completed off of West Street near Gibraltar. And, they had a whole range of different funding sources. You could put the Habitat for Humanity housing in this middle category, and those are able to meet a lower price point because they have a lot of volunteer labor and contributions to the project. So, with these first two categories, it really comes down to how can the property developer find a way to cut into their costs through other sources? How can they use financing from other sources that may not be the typical private financing to enable the project to move forward? And so Town Court certainly used low-income tax credits, and I'm sure they had private financing as well. It was done by a private developer that focuses on affordable housing. And there's many of those types of developers operating in the country today. Many are based in this region. Finally, market affordable housing. I use the Admiral Farragut apartments as an example. These are apartments that are just basically priced for people who are, on a moderate income. And it's due to the fact that, they're in some cases they're aging apartments. They don't have maybe all the amenities that other apartment complexes have, but this is a pretty, as far as I think of it, it's a pretty solid place to live. It's well kept. It's well occupied. And so there are some of these in Annapolis. You could say the former Watergate apartments, Nautilus Point, was long considered one of these types of market affordable housing developments. It's got a new owner today. The price point might be changing in the future. It's hard to know. The market affordable housing will fluctuate, and some might not be affordable tomorrow because it's all based on the market.
Yeah, something
All right,
like.
do you have time? Do you have time for a quick question?
Sure.
So is it fair to say that something like Town Courts, where it's eligible for low income tax credits, there are some restrictions there because once the tax credits are issued, they can't go crazy they can't become market rate housing.
Right.
They're limited by the fact that they've received credits.
That's right. Their units have to be priced for somebody that's earning less than 80% of the area median income.
And who enforces that?
It's Teresa, I think, can chime in on it, but I think it's CDA. It's the state's community development agency.
Correct.
Yeah, and they're the ones. I guess they're a part. Teresa, they're a part of the state's Department of Housing and Community Development, right?
Right. They're the housing finance,
Yeah.
housing finance agency of the department and of the state.
Mm-hmm.
So
they have staff that goes around and makes sure that these aren't just turning over in a few years
Oh,
to
there's-
market rate housing.
Oh, absolutely. They have all kinds of, believe me.
there's an annual certification process, right? I think?
Right. That's annual certification process for people's incomes, but there's all kinds of controls on these properties by DHCD through their asset management. So
Got it. Thanks.
stuff, recorded in the land records and,
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So I kind of reference, that we are in a housing crisis here in the city. I don't think it can be understated. These are some graphs from the Housing Affordability Task Force that Alderman Gay had spearheaded a couple of years ago, that really just basically identify Annapolis as one of the most expensive places to live in the country. And the task force situated Annapolis among this group of large metropolitan areas, major cities, and it comes up close to the most unaffordable cities. This is the ratio of median home sales price to median family income on the left. And on the right, this is just a simple chart taken from Zillow, the website, the real estate website, that shows the sort of gradual climb of home prices in Annapolis over the last 10 years or so, which has basically gotten us to a situation where these are provided with a staff report. It's come out of our market and demographic study that was done for the comprehensive planning process. And I'm going to zoom in because I think it's hard to see, at least for me. So what these show, in 2021, the median sales price of a home in Annapolis was $625,000. And you can see on the bottom axis, you have to make 140% of the area median income to come close to affording that. And even that, I'd say, is probably going to be challenging. It's based on some standard, down payment and a third of your monthly income type guidelines. But that's where we are on home sales. And then on rentals, median 3-bedroom rent, a little over 2,000. And for that, you need to be making around 80% of the area median income to be in range of paying for that. So that's kind of a sobering status of where our housing supply is and cost of it. Reasons for that? Well, I said things didn't happen overnight, but I think if you look at, this is a map of finalized residential permits over the last 10 years. You can see how many more yellow dots there are than orange. The yellow ones are single family dwellings. Generally, we're talking about single family detached houses or attached, which would be a townhouse. Very little multifamily developments. That's the MFD, orange dot. On this map, the only one that's showing is the redevelopment of the Hacka property on Clay Street, which is now known as Oberry Court, formerly College Creek Terrace. And that was essentially replacing 1-for-1 the units that were there with a completely new development. I think there was a net gain of 20 units that may have been just due to Habitat for Humanity homes, if I'm not mistaken. So very little apartment development in the city over the last 10 years. This is only going through 2020. So the Town Courts project, which is over here, was finished, over here. It was finished in 2021. So that does factor in here, but that's one reason. And certainly some of these are major renovations of existing houses, which may have been formerly a duplex, a triplex that is now just one single family house. There's plenty of those stories in Eastport. This is just a glimpse of what some of those developments are, just in case you know the names of some of these developments. Most are really marketed towards higher income residents. You can see Oberry Court here, but this is really what has happened in the last 10 years. And, just in terms of if you don't know the names, these are what they look like. So a lot of higher end homes, and that's really, that's where the profit is for a real estate developer. I mean, that's, the land is expensive. And so to make a return, whatever your bottom line is, building for this demographic, the higher income demographic is really where the profit is. Why do we have so few apartments or multifamily development? Well, we have 31 zoning districts in the city. It's a lot for just 8 square miles, but here's really the big metric. 61% of our land area in the city does not allow for 2 or more dwelling units. So that's a pretty it's a pretty graphic number in my opinion, and it just basically says that we have very few places where you could conceivably even build homes for this sort of missing middle demographic, this workforce population. And where we do have those places, there's all kinds of other constraints.
But there is a process to get a waiver for that, isn't there? We already
You
decided
can
that.
you can always go through a variance process.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
So if somebody wanted to do it, they're not stopped at the moment.
right. And it's just, you're putting a lot on, you're risking a lot to sort of go down that road without knowing what's going to happen. And so it's not something a lot of property developers really want to enter into unless they have absolutely no other option. So that kind of the outcome of that situation is we're losing population in certain demographic age-wise. You can see on the top chart in the last 10 years, we're losing in that 18 to 24 age category, down 10%. And that's consistent with the county and the state, which is, we're the blue, Annapolis is blue, and then the state is orange and county is green. But so, you can imagine there are some college age kids in there that are leaving and may never come back. But then you have the 25 to 34, but that's where Annapolis is losing a lot of population, but it's actually gaining in the county and the state. And then 45 to 54, we're all losing in that category. And then we're losing a little bit in this 55 to 64. But I'm really kind of, I zero in on the younger demographics who are not generally able to afford to live in Annapolis. And then you have this chart on the bottom, which shows that we're really not, in the last 10 years, we're not growing the family households in comparison to Anne Arundel County or the state. That's the green bar. We are growing a bit of the non-family household, singles, couples, but slower than the county, the state. And then finally, housing cost burden. This is a lot of information in this particular chart. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but it's just basically showing that at almost every income range, there is a growing cost burden. And what that means is the population that's paying more than a third of their monthly income to their mortgage or to their rent, that constitutes being cost burden. And then that's the blue. The green is if you're paying more than 50% of your monthly salary towards your rent or your mortgage. And so you can see even in the over 120% AMI, there's still a bit of cost burden there. In the 80 to 120% of the AMI, you have both of those types of cost burden. And that's for both people who own a home and for people who rent. So that cost burden is growing. So who benefits from this legislation? I pulled this from Massachusetts Housing. They did profiles of the kind of people that are benefiting from workforce housing in their communities. And it could be comparable to here. That's why I thought it was worth including. I mean, these are some cases these are all families in this case, but there's single people, there's couples, there's people who we're trying to attract, to participate in our arts community. There's people who are teachers. We talk to We're doing projects with St. John's College related to trails and water access. And, they tell us they can't attract new faculty because their faculty they can't pay them enough to live here. And so it's a sort of a cascading impact. Finally, getting to the legislation, this is the last part, and then we can take more questions and discuss. But the basic idea, I wanted to show this image. This is some newer workforce. Well, it's actually veteran housing, if I'm not mistaken. Teresa can correct me, but this is on Clay Street. I love these houses. They're basically duplexes. They were, I think this is at the corner of Clay and West Washington Streets. And yeah, I think it's turned out to be a good project. So the legislation, the basic idea is that we are adding a new land use to our use tables in the zoning code. You can see an excerpt from the use table here shows that we have a whole range of dwelling types that are allowed in the city to varying degrees, depending on what zoning district you're in. Well, the legislation proposes to add a new category of dwelling unit that is specifically priced for workforce housing. And it would just fit right into this group of land uses. And I should say that these symbols here, for anybody who reads the zoning code, that it basically tells you if something is permitted or not. If it's a P, it means it's essentially by right. You can do that, no problem, no questions asked. You just have to meet the guidelines for setbacks, etc. If it says P, STD, it means permitted, but subject to certain standards that you have to meet. S is special exception, so it's still allowed, but you have to go through a separate review process. And then you have some S-STD, so it's special exception and subject to standards. So this new land use would be permitted almost every zoning district in the city, with the exception of the industrial, which is this light purple, my cursor is pointing at off of Chinkapin, those warehouse district off of Chinkapin, and then there's another portion off of Gibraltar. That's the I-1 district, industrial, and then the 4 waterfront maritime districts. So you have the industrial one is this light blue on Back Creek here, or like a royal blue. You have the turquoise is the waterfront maritime Eastport on Back Creek, and a few pieces on Spa Creek. You have this darker blue is the waterfront maritime mixed, and then you have the waterfront maritime conservation is where Annapolis Yacht Club and a few other properties along that stretch of Compromise Street are. And so there's generally, there's really no residential development encouraged in those districts at this point in time. So what we're saying with the legislation is that if you put 60% of your units priced for workforce families, your zoning changes to R4, which is the top of our residential zoning districts. I think some people think of it as the densest zoning district in the city. We go from R1 to R4. Personally, I feel like it's a misnomer to think of it as the densest in the city. It is, but when you look at the density of a dwelling unit, you can see it's for multifamily dwellings, 1,700 square feet is still the standard for square footage for a dwelling unit. That's larger than a lot of houses. So I think it's important to just keep that in mind, that even our densest zoning district in the city is still basically asking developers to build a fairly large sized dwelling unit. Now, there are some provisions to lower that number if you do structured parking, a parking garage. So some of our larger projects in the city, we're able to bring that number down to 1,000 because they like because they have a parking garage as part of the project. So that's this little footnote here next to the 1,700. You can see the lot dimensions, still fairly large, like a 50 by 100 square foot lot, more or less. And then you have all the setbacks, and then you have, in terms of height coverage, floor area ratio is used, which in this case it's 2, which means essentially you could build, if you filled out the lot completely, you could build 2 stories of that. Finally, just want to close with one example. You know, of course, nobody knows exactly how much housing will be built using this legislation. It's just impossible to know. But one thing I'm particularly interested in is the potential to create more of that missing middle housing in places where we see large single family homes today, because that's what's allowed. And so this is an example on Bay Ridge Avenue where you have popular restaurant Vin 909 is flanked by an older 2-story mixed use building that has retail on the first floor, 3 apartments on the second floor. That is not conforming to the current B1 zoning district that it's in. So it wouldn't be allowed today. It wouldn't get built today. You have a new 3-story single family home, or I guess you could call it 2.5. It's got a large attic type floor on the third. You have an office, professional office space next door to that. All of these 3, the restaurant, the single family home, and the professional office, are conforming to the zoning. It's just this one that actually helps address some of our housing issues is not conforming. And so you could say, well, why don't we just change the zoning and allow for multifamily housing in the B1 district? Well, that's certainly one great solution, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the housing that's created is going to be affordable. And that's still the challenge. And so with this legislation, we are allowing people to build more units, provided that they are priced affordably for people who need them. And that's really the key thing to remember. It's not just about building more, but it's building for a demographic that's currently being displaced and not able to move to Annapolis, that I think is important to having a sustainable economy and culture, and basically reduce impact a lot of the issues that are affecting the city today. So that's the presentation. Happy to go back to any slides if people have questions.
True. Questions?
We could also just kind of go into the legislation too. I mean, that's that's what we're here to talk about. So
Yeah, I don't have any particular questions on the presentation necessarily. I do have some questions on some things in the staff report that I'd like to get some clarification on.
let's see. Let me
I do have one question on the presentation you gave. Have you had any feedback from anybody in the development community as to whether what's been proposed would provide a reasonable incentive to make any real difference, or are we going to end up with something like in the NPDU legislation, as outlined in the staff report, that the incentive really wasn't strong enough to have had much of an effect? I'm just curious. I mean, it all based on all the things you've talked about. It sounds reasonable. It just would be interesting to know if there's anybody in the development community that says, yeah, this might change my mind as to whether I would want to put these affordable, that density bonus is worth, the trade-off for the affordability.
I've heard some positive feedback, you know, that it could be a game changer for some projects. And projects that, you know, there's some developers who are market rate developers who don't have any interest in affordable housing and frankly don't like our MPD ordinance. And I've heard from at least one that this might change the way they think, you know, because then they can basically, if they're trying to price things for 120% area median income, that might be the low end of their profit, you know, pro forma, but they wouldn't be pricing anything for that range ordinarily, you know. So, but I think for the folks that do affordable housing, it definitely would help.
Well, do any other commissioners have questions on the presentation before we sort of start getting down? Because I no doubt questions on the legislation specifically probably will be a little bit more detailed. So
Yeah.
any sort of top level questions on the?
Are we removing anything major from the existing? Or is this just additions? Because this covers a very broad area of types of housing. So you would think you'd remove something else because it would be encompassed in this.
I'm not following you. Removing you're talking about housing from the city, like something that we're losing?
No, you go back to that where you were showing where you'd fit it in with the other dwellings for the permitted versus subject to standards. Is anything being taken out of those charts or just the addition of the one line?
Oh, it's just the addition of the one line. Yeah, I mean, I think we certainly need to do, I think we have to do a larger overhaul of our zoning, but that's just a bigger undertaking. So I think this is seen as something that could be a real, you know, help in the short term.
Is there anything that drove this? Because I saw that it would be allowed in all zoning districts, and I know the WNAV site is an R1 and will require variance. But if something like this was done, would that project then not have to get the variance to go where it's going? Or
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that site is zoned for R1.
right?
And
So
yeah.
just, this is Jackie. The WNAV site actually cannot be developed for tax credit housing without legislation like this. There isn't a variance that they can get that would allow them to move forward with that project. And
Exactly.
Eric, I think it's important to clarify that this workforce housing is really geared, this legislation is just one of other options that we hope to promote in the future that are geared more towards the other smaller components of the missing middle. But tax credit housing, as we understand it, you know, where you have to apply to the federal government for tax credits, about the minimum size project that you can put together and put together a total financing package for in order to make it work. And that's not the only financing they get. Teresa can talk about this a little bit more, but it's around 60 units. So this is not geared towards, because a major component of this is that you have to do the affordable housing within this. I think Eric touched on that.
Yeah, it's going to be hard for a lot of projects to pencil out in certain parts of the city, but
we have some people from the community, our community housing committee who are going to testify tonight, and who worked very hard on helping to put this legislation together. And I think they can provide additional insight. I mean, we've worked very closely with them and the Housing and Human Welfare Committee on drafting and scoping the legislation. And I think they can provide some insight on why, what this is geared to, that is more technical.
Okay, and if anybody can answer and give insight whenever that's going to occur tonight to why
Right.
if it's going to be in every zone except those few, why are we accepting those few? If we're making every other zone out there able to have this, and it kind of just, you can insert this type of housing anywhere.
Right.
One, you name it, but yet we're not doing those few. Why not
Well,
add those?
it's the industrial district that we decided that it was, there is no housing whatsoever under any circumstances in the industrial zone. It's in all of our residential zones, as well as our commercial zones and our office and mixed use zones, there are some limited types of housing you can currently do. I mean, in most commercial districts, you can do, upstairs residential. So there is some, but not in the industrial district. And we omitted the maritime districts because they also do not allow any housing. And because there were, the recent code change where they were totally redone and restructured and to preserve them for maritime use. I mean, there was a point in our city's history where we did allow multifamily residential as a special exception in our industrial districts. And what started happening with that was that we got those big high-rise housing projects like over in Eastport, and the decision was made at some point to remove that use so that our entire waterfront did not turn into a one long housing project, and we had land to preserve for maritime uses. And so in the 80s, that's when we began redoing the maritime districts so that we're saving them for our maritime industry, which is so important to the cities, but they could not compete with the residential in terms of keeping in the maritime uses. And that's
Yeah,
why we don't have
I think the short
multifamily.
answer is
Right.
incompatible use.
Right.
Yeah.
But if you wanted a
Those
more
five
detailed
zones.
answer, as to why which I thought Ben was asking for, that's why I was offering that.
The other thing is, when once industrial uses, and that also includes maritime industrial, once those go away, they're never coming back,
Right.
And this could be in the historic districts or NC neighborhoods, neighborhood conservation. You put it anywhere.
Right.
Yep. Okay.
But historic district, certainly there's a whole host of guidelines that.
But where we're going to actually get workforce housing is where the land is more affordable. I mean, that, there are just so many factors that go into this. You are not going to get, workforce housing in the historic district or any place where land values are extremely high. Like when 51 Franklin, which was an office building, was converted to apartments or to residential units, those units all sold for 1.5 million and up. Same thing happened with the rec center. That's how much those units sold for, because that's the market drove those. Where you're going to get this is where the land cost is a hugely significant factor in terms of putting together one of these projects for a developer.
Eric, are you, and Alex, it's, I guess, for both of you, is this an opportunity for us to ask some questions about the legislation and how it's supposed to work?
Well, it would be good. I feel like maybe we could clarify the format, and because I know there are people who are waiting to testify, and I don't know when that should happen, or but we should pivot. It's whenever you're to the.
Yeah, I think this is a good, I think the general questions seem to have been mostly answered. And I think this is a good time to get into the specifics of the legislation. Obviously you've gone over a little bit of it, but I think what may be interesting in it to talk about is not only the legislation itself as first reader, but you have a number of suggestions early on in the staff report as to changes that you're recommending. And I actually have some questions on those, and Bob may have zeroed in on some of that too.
I only have 12 questions, so that's not very many.
I just got one top level one. When did we start working on this package? How many months ago doing this?
Gosh,
This has been 2 years in the making. You have to
Yeah.
include the process of the Affordable Housing Task Force in this.
Yeah, I mean, Chair, Commissioner Sale, I mean, you asked about where it's coming from. I mean, we had the Housing Affordability Task Force, and then we had the formation of the, there's a city council resolution to create the Affordable Housing and Community Development Equity Commission. And they were really tasked to kind of take the Housing Affordability Task Force's recommendations and then sort of transition that into some real zoning or other solutions that, you know, could be implemented. And so that's really where this came from.
Okay.
Would it be helpful for me to share the staff report, or does somebody else? want-
Sure. You know, I think, you know, the legislation itself on, as it introduced on first reader is only a couple of pages.
Mhm.
And I mean, if you can show it, I think we've really, you know, more or less kind of gone over that, but why don't you go ahead and, if you want to display it.
Yeah.
Because we can then talk about some of the suggestions that staff has made that I do have questions about.
Yeah. I just want to clarify, I mean, the reason why that, I mean, there's a number of recommended amendments. It's just that I would say that we've just been talking about this for a while, and, you know, the more we talk about, the more we see the opportunity for improvement. So these are the things that have come out, and they are specific to the, kind of have to look at the actual legislation to know the page numbers and so forth. But
Right, so if you go down to the next page,
okay.
you know, that first part is really all of what you talked about in the use tables, basically adds workforce housing is a use permitted subject to standards. And then there's some standards that are displayed there in, you know, the bottom of the page.
Right.
And that gets to the, you know, how many units in rental and ownership have to be provided to be part of this program, et cetera.
That's right. So this is the 40% in terms of home ownership. If it's a home ownership project, it's 40%. And if it's a rental project, it's 60% of the total units have to be priced. Now, this is, the first reader has it at it sets the income level maximum at 100%. We had a recommendation to raise that to 120, which seems to be more of the national standard for that.
And is it safe to say that the recommendations of this, in the recommended amendments are not just from staff, but those, if I remember correctly, much of that came out of you know, public discussions in the Housing and Human Welfare Committee and in other forums. So
Yes.
it's not just the recommendations that you make before this are not necessarily just from planning and zoning staff, but they're from a sort of much more broad set of discussions. Is that a fair statement?
Somewhat. It really is staff, Housing and Human Welfare Committee of City Council, and then this Affordable Housing and Community Development Equity Commission, the commission with the really long name. That's what we call them. But
Right.
Yeah, those three groups, I think, and that's where the recommendation.
So some of those recommendations are amendments we would likely see once this legislation goes to full discussion at the city council. Is that also a fair statement?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when can I ask questions about the?
Yeah, I think this is a really good time. Why don't you take it away, Bob?
All right. First of all, I want to applaud everybody for the strategy here. It's a really elegant strategy, which is quite simple. But as always, one wants to look at what the potential consequences may be and how it's going to work. So let me begin a series of questions. I gather that you included commercial zones as kind of a way of creating mixed use zones without having to do your wholesale rezoning. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
All right, so this is a way of creating mixed use, right?
Well, that's not really, I mean, I wouldn't say mixed use isn't a core intent here. It's really just, we want to create more workforce housing, but to the extent that that could be integrated with other compatible uses, I think, that from the comprehensive planning perspective, that is a valuable outcome to this process, but that's not really I would not say that's a core intent of the legislation at all. It's not really.
Right. I think I misspoke. I didn't mean to say that this is a sort of a backdoor way of creating mixed use, but it does, in a sense, create or offer the opportunities for some kind of mixed use areas where there's commercial activity and residential life.
Mhm. I think there's.
Okay, so that's as a start. I mean, that's why you've included that. Second question. Anything that's built pursuant to this legislation is subject to the R4 bulk setback and so forth requirements. I'm frankly not familiar with what the R4 requirements are in terms of buffering, open space, and so forth and so on. So if in two parts, what are the requirements? And secondly, how can you ensure that a new development is community character compatible with a surrounding area, which is all, I don't know, 1 story, 2 story, whatever it is. And all of a sudden you have what R4 allows. So the question is twofold. What does R4 allow? And then how do you ensure a compatibility with the character, which, by the way, was spoken of in the 2009 comp plan. So do you understand my question?
I do. I'll try to answer it, but I hope others will chime in. I think that character is used a lot to basically limit, what can happen where. It's a pretty subjective term, obviously. I think that single family homes can be, not in the character of an existing community is really, we rely, I think when something is proposed for a certain location, there's very little in our zoning code that really stipulates an architecture or style. It's not like, that's not something we regulate, but in the code as much as something that happens through the kind of negotiated process with any project that is trying to get, its approvals. And so I don't see the potential for a R4 project to, be a detriment to an existing neighborhood any more than any other type of project.
Well, that's interesting, but let's go to the first part of the question. What are the R4 requirements?
Right.
And how in any way would they be limited if a 4-story building were plucked down in the middle of an otherwise single family detached neighborhood?
I think that, everything is contingent upon the size of the property that you're talking about. I mean, it's obviously like a project has to work with what it has in terms of its site and constraints around that site. So it's really hard to sort of talk about a standard situation. But if you look at, so here's the standards for R4, when you talk about multifamily dwellings, which would, be kind of the standard that we'd be looking at for this workforce housing. It's kind of what I was trying to get at in the presentation. I mean, you have a pretty large square footage for a dwelling unit in this 1,700 square feet. You have lot dimensions of 4,800. So that's the minimum. You have width, lot dimensions. These are all, fairly comparable to other residential zones. The main differences with other residential zones is this density, square footage of a standard dwelling unit. That is less than what you'd find in R1 or R2 or R3. I mean, I think R1, I think, is 7,500, if I'm not mistaken. I think R2 is 5,400.
These are lot sizes?
No, this is just the dwelling unit size.
Can be no larger than.
Yeah, the lot dimensions, those are going to be much larger as well. And then the setbacks are all pretty much in line with what you see in other residential areas. I think it's the floor area ratio is not something you always find in the residential zoning districts. And that's just a way of basically saying how much intensity you can have on a given site. And so, I mean, if your concern is, that like on a single family lot in a neighborhood, like, could you build a 4-story building? No, you couldn't. You could build a maximum of, if you wanted to fill out the entire lot without setbacks, you could build 2 stories based on this R4. You could build more units within that footprint because you have a smaller dwelling unit size. So, I mean, that's really the idea. I mean, in a expensive neighborhood, you're probably not going to be able to make this pencil out because the land costs are going to be so high that any apartment development that wants to go there is not going to want to, even if they could use the R4 zoning, they're not going to want to limit the rent of these units to something that's priced, for a workforce family. They're going to need to make back their investment. And
I'm thinking,
so yeah.
I'm not thinking expensive
example for
neighborhoods.
that?
I'm thinking, say, Tyler Avenue between Hilltop and Forest Drive.
yeah,
That area, whatever Jan Wall or whatever you want to call it out there. There's some very large lots with one family on them, one family house. And I could see somebody saying, it's a pretty big lot. I might be able to build a 3 or 4 story building on that lot. I mean, what is to limit? The only limit that you've proposed is the cost of land. But when you're going into different neighborhoods other than, expensive neighborhoods, which is.
And no parking restrictions, right?
No parking restrictions and no, I can't, and that's one of my other questions, but what's to limit? Somebody who aggregates, say, 2 of those fairly large lots off of Tyler Avenue back there and wants to put up I don't know, I'm not good with numbers, but it could be 4, 6 stories.
I mean, I would say that if the community there was so adamantly opposed to having more housing in that area, they would protest it in the same way they didn't want a gas station at the corner of Tyler and Forest Drive.
And I agree, but you're not giving that community any kind of standards by which to make that protest. You're not, there's nothing in the legislation that says anything about being compatible in any way with what's around. You know, and I'm not, all I'm just saying is,
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, I think compatibility is just it's a very challenging thing to regulate, you know, I mean.
well, I understand, and I understand that in the course of this, you know, some duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes will be built.
Yeah, I mean,
But when it's R4 regulations, which are pretty, you know, the most open-ended regulations of all in the code, it gives one pause, or at least gives me pause.
mhm.
So, I mean, that's a question that's on the floor that maybe somebody else could answer. Next question. I didn't understand this language that parking and buffers, quote, cannot be included. I don't understand what that meant.
Oh, actually, I think I can nip that one. I mean, it's basically, we just want to make sure that if a property developer or an owner is actually providing common open space, that they're not including like the marginal planting buffer that just separates a parking area from, like, it has to be usable, functional space.
So that's why you added that better definition of common
Yeah.
open space?
Yeah, there were a few other things that came up through discussion that would kind of help to clarify what the intent of the common open
Is
space.
common open space required in any way to developments under this legislation? Or is it just if it happens to be included? I mean, is it required?
It is required.
It
We're
is
just not-
required. So even if you're doing a duplex, there has to be some common open space?
Right.
Well, that's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, I can understand it
Yeah,
when you've
back-
got, say, 4 or more units.
I mean, that might be, you know, that might be a recommendation, but yeah, I mean, we just wanted to leave some flexibility there, but the more important thing was to clarify that this can't just be a marginal thing, you know, it has to be intentional and integrated, you know.
Well, I think that's laudable, and we've seen in many applications before us, the inclusion of, you know, nonsense little things that get included into the open space calculation, which shouldn't have been. But good, that's a good thing that you're doing. But I question whether common open space, is it required for all developments under this legislation?
It is. I mean, that's-
Okay, well, that's an interesting question as to whether it can be provided when you're talking about a lot with a whole lot of room and you're just putting a duplex, you know, or I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
A smaller property. So one conceivable thought is whether common open space should be required when there are 4 or more units or 3 or more units, and whatever the you know, whatever the common sense line should be. Okay.
Rick,
next-
I'm sorry, doesn't it fall along adequate public facilities rules when it comes to,
That's a good
you know,
question.
open space?
Does APF apply to an application under this legislation?
It depends on the size of the property, the size of the project.
Okay, so APF applies if large enough?
Yes.
Okay. That's wise. I think that's wise that it not apply to smaller ones. What under 21 site design review under 2122? Help me out. What is that? What's 2122? Is that the Board of Appeals? Site design review?
Oh,
Site
sorry.
design review is the purview of the planning commission. You all
That's
make.
what we do.
findings.
That's community character and all the
Right.
criteria that we have to meet to approve a development.
Okay, let me ask the question as simply as I can then. So any application under this legislation would come before the planning commission for review, site design review? Is
I think that's probably true. I mean, yes, I think that would be, if it's a major site design, and it would, yes.
If it's a major site design, well,
Major
let's,
site designs are approved by the planning commission. Minor
Okay.
site designs are approved by planning staff.
okay, so let's say developer gets acquisition of one of those large properties on Tyler Heights and wants to put up a triplex. Is that a major site design?
We would actually really have to look at the specific size. I don't know that there's a minimum size for projects with minor site design. I'll be happy to look that up right now for you, Bob. But I think, Eric, I think it's really important to stress the fact that we're talking a lot about smaller projects here, but this legislation is really geared towards tax credit housing where you're getting subsidies to do it. And going back to the thought that I introduced before, and I think when we get to public testimony, you can get some more explanation about this, that you're not going to get very small projects that are going to be able to put together a financing package and do tax credit housing.
But this is Knox tax credit housing.
Yes.
It's market rate.
Eric, I think you need to talk a little bit about
No,
recall-
Jackie's correct. I mean, in comments so far, I mean, there was a lot of discussion about market rate, I referenced potential for market rate housing to use this, but really, I mean, Jackie's correct that I think in the short term, the projects that are going to probably find the most immediate benefit are the ones that use the low income tax credits.
Right. So Eric's
And will still
presentation-
qualify as workforce housing?
Well, I think that Eric's presentation focused on the topic of affordable housing generally and many different avenues that in the future we hope to pursue to provide a variety of different housing types that are, affordable. But this legislation focuses on one type of affordable housing. And so you have to separate that, what he said in the presentation, from what this legislation is proposing. And it's filling up a one spot in that whole presentation, and it's geared towards allowing a larger project. I really, I think the public testimony that we have from the community development committee meeting people and all will be enlightening for you, because we work very closely with them on this, and it has a specific set of goals. But you have to go back and look at it. Eric, can you scroll back to the part about, the qualifications? So if you read this under, you have to have recorded deed restrictions, and then it goes into 40%, so a big percentage of the units in a workforce housing project of this type have to be tax credit housing. They essentially become tax credit housing.
Okay,
This is
I'll wait-
geared
I'll
towards
wait.
projects like say the Willows,
Yeah,
or to what's been proposed for the WNAV site, which is also a tax credit housing project. It's geared towards to provide a path forward for projects of that type.
okay. I think there are several people on that commission
Right.
who are really expert in this, and I think I'll wait
Yes.
to hear what they have to say, because I'm a little confused as to whether this is pointed towards tax credited housing or workforce market rate housing, or some blend of the two. So let's hold that for later. Next question. The rental rates are to be approved by planning and zoning. Are you guys in a position to determine what proper rentals are? Or are there standards that are easily followed that you can simply promulgate?
I think we should ask Teresa to respond to that.
The rental rates on any federal or state financing is determined by the federal or state finance.
So what if the development is not tax credited, or 60% of the units in the building are not tax credit supported, then they can, then what rental rates can they ask for? Demand.
Sorry, just need to separate. It's not that they have to be tax credit units. It's they have to be priced to the, to the maximum income threshold. The whole project might be using low income tax credit, but it's.
So I guess my question is there a bright line that exists in federal housing regulations that say for workforce housing, it can, you can only charge a rent that's equal to some percentage of their adjusted gross income? I mean, is there a bright line, or is poor Mr. Laplace going to have to like cast about and try to determine what rental rates to charge? I don't know. I mean, what's the answer to that? It just says they shall be approved by P&Z without reference to any kind of outside standard. Okay, that's a question that's out there, okay? I mean, I think it needs to be answered. It's just because it's.
Well, I think maybe the best way to respond is that, Teresa, maybe you could comment on how the MPDUs work. And
Right,
how-
Well, typically what we look at is we want the rents to be so that people are not paying more than 30% of their income.
Okay, so.
So,
Okay, so let's take it. I gather. I go there. I show my tax returns. I get a rental rate that's 30% of my income. Next year, I get a bonus and a raise, and my income goes up. Does my rent automatically go up, or who's going to be looking at this sort of thing?
well, basically the way we do the MPDU program is the rental rates are set based on the affordability of people at 80% of median. And that comes out of HUD. So we calculate what that would be, what 30% would be, and we come up with a rate. If a person gets the next year earns more money, we allow in the MPDU program them to go up to 120%.
Okay.
So we allow up to 120%, and then after 120%, then we do ask them to leave, and we give them time enough to find.
Okay,
another
so
place.
what I'm getting is that there is a process to calculate this, and it's not really just open-ended.
Correct.
Okay, I'll leave that. Line 101 about parking. Where do I get that?
In the recommendations.
Well,
Yeah.
okay, what's it say in the recommendations?
Well, we didn't have anything about parking in the first reader. So that's
Okay.
so this, what you're talking about is right here.
What parking is required under 2166?
Oh, that's just the guidelines for, the size of the spacing, just 2166 just has a range of, standards you have to meet for like any kind of parking, that's just the.
Yeah, like the size of the spaces and how they fit and all that kind of stuff.
Angle, the maximum angle that you could have them at, that kind of.
So the question that's related to this that I have is that the way this reads to me is that there's no required parking, but if you do add any, so if you said, okay, I'm not going to put any, then of course those standards don't apply. But if you say, I want to put in one space, to me, what that says is that then those standards apply. And one of those standards is the number of minimum parking spaces based on the use. So does that mean if you build one spot, all of a sudden now all the minimums kick in and you have to follow that? I mean, that's the way it reads. I don't know
So
if that's-
that may need some
Yeah,
tweaking,
that's a
Alex.
good
That's
pick.
not the intent. The intent
Okay.
is that if you decided you wanted to provide parking and you were providing one or two spaces, that it would have to meet like the space size and aisle widths and those design standards, it would not trigger you having to provide X number of total spaces.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
we
so
may
I
need
I
to,
think we need to
Right.
think about that wording, and I when I was in front of the Housing Human Welfare Committee, that something that I zeroed in on, and I think this wording just doesn't cover that in the way you intend.
well,
So
that's
I was
excellent,
curious what
but
the intent
That's a
was.
great
Right.
point.
So I
That's a
think
great
I know that now.
we can easily, that's a really good catch, and we can easily address that by drilling down on what section of chapter 2166, which is the parking chapter, would they need to comply with,
Okay,
which would be the design standards.
okay, good. We open.
Excellent catch.
Thank you. I want to go back to actually something Diane raised and touches on the issue of, quote, community character compatibility. What about conservation zones? I mean, if you've got, there are conservation zones around the city. Would an application have to abide by those conservation zones?
That's a good
So are
point.
you're talking about like where we would be allowing it in the R2NC, for example? Yes, but you're still subject to the design standards in a conservation zone, regardless of what you're doing.
But where does it say that in the legislation?
You have to go back and that's in the R2NC chapter. So that's in the general. So each zoning
Where
district
does
in
it
the
say
city
that
has
in
a
the-
general section with
Jackie,
design
sorry to interrupt, but
standards.
where does it say it in the legislation that any application has to abide by, I don't know, design standards of the zone in which it is? The only thing this legislation says is that it applies to every zone in the city except industrial and maritime.
Right, but if you look at the use tables, so it's listed as a permitted use in each one of the zones, so if you look at for example, the R2NC, it's going to list the different types of things that are allowed in R2NC. But then to figure out that you have to meet the design standards, you go back to the R2NC general. That's just
Okay,
the way the
okay.
code is structured.
Okay, I'm sorry, I missed that then. So that
It
what this does is this inserts a new use into the code.
Into the use tables, yes,
Permitted, subject to standards.
yes.
I somehow feel like it should say that clearly somewhere.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
I think it's a fair point that, I mean, just for clarity purposes that, if I hear Jackie as well, that
Right.
just this code's already structured for you to have to refer back. If there's another standard that's already in place in that area that.
Right. I mean, I could talk about my neighborhood. I don't think I shouldn't, but there's standards, conservation zone, and I could see some, anyway, you get my point.
Right.
I don't think I need to belabor it, but I do think that it needs to be absolutely clarified that the standards that it is permitted subject to are the standards that exist currently in any zone, or however, I just.
Okay, well, we can, Eric, if you scroll down to the standards that are in the legislation, we can add that as a standard under where that you have to comply with the general requirements for the zone in which it's located. And that would clarify that, Bob.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And we can even have a code cross-reference there.
Good. I think that's pretty much the last one, though, is kind of the Hyatt proposal, which we had a work session on. Looks to me like some of that could really qualify for this. I mean, is it?
You're talking about the Park Place?
No,
He's talking
I'm
about
talking
Parole
about,
Place.
Old Solomon's Island Road.
Right.
Parole Place.
It's called Parole Place, and yes,
Parole.
that certainly is a possibility.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so parking, that needs to be clarified. I still am concerned about when it says, R4. I'm concerned about plunking things down in the middle of R1s and 2s. And I think we've answered the rest of the questions, and thank you for your time.
Welcome.
Okay, somebody else want to go? Anybody
Yeah, I
else
have a couple of questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Oops, sorry. So I'm looking at the, that ubiquitous picture of the missing middle housing diagram, which I love because it shows fourplexes and Eric, as you said, some of the kinds of housing that we had historically in Annapolis, but now because of land costs, aren't that, or actually because of zoning, we don't have anymore. But that picture depicts quad, like fourplexes and fiveplexes, or, bigger, but not much bigger than 6 houses. I'm trying to figure out, like, now we're talking about larger scale developments, like 60 units. So are we really answering or solving this missing middle housing dilemma with much bigger projects than is anticipated by this missing middle housing, at least form?
I mean, by requiring, the price points of the units to be priced for workforce incomes, we are addressing that need, if that's what you mean. I mean,
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is because, like you said, the price of land is so expensive, you're not going to buy a big piece, a piece of property in West Annapolis or Eastport that has some land and put a fourplex on it. In order to make that work, you're going to have to put 10 units on it and go vertically in order to make it work. So I'm just not sure in terms of community character what that does.
well, you wouldn't be able to do that. I mean,
Right.
that's, you'd be basically, to do like something bigger, you'd need more land, which adds more cost to your expenses. So it's not like you just wouldn't be, I mean, you're not able to just do something crazy on a small site. And that's just not, that's
Right.
not-
So you would be going to places like Bob was referring to, like that development in the area around Tyler Heights, Jan Wall, that, between Forest Drive and Hilltop. There are places there where there's still big enough lots where you could do a quadruplex, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Right, but even on those lots, Diane, you're gonna find that someone would have to put together, all of those lots along Tyler that Bob referenced, they're only 50 feet wide. It would be really difficult unless you acquired a couple of them, at least 2 of them, to increase the density there. I mean, there are other constraints for those sites and in terms of redevelopment. But Eric's whole missing middle part in his diagram is something that I think that Eric and other people see as future. There is going to have to be new zoning developed that will allow a lot of that stuff that Eric is showing in his missing middle diagram. That this, what we're proposing here is like more towards the mid-rise at the end. And
Right.
and we all recognize that this is Eric's dream here, the missing middle here. But that zoning will have to be developed in a way that is where it's going to be more in a community, like in Eastport or in West Annapolis or Admiral Heights, where where you're putting it right down in the middle of, like, say, a row of single family dwellings, for example. There's going to have to be a more emphasis on compatibility in terms of design. And if you go back and look at, if Eric showed a whole bunch of pictures here are his pictures of houses that exist right now that are in these communities. You look at that 6-unit project on Constitution, it looks like 2 single family dwellings, or you know, the 3 units on Chesapeake where these look like part of, they don't really look any different than houses that are on that street. So.
This legislation is not going to promote more of these type of buildings to be
No,
built,
that's
because from what,
future, that's Eric's future dream legislation,
Well,
right, Eric?
let me throw out a scenario that gets to this and sort of builds on both the comments that Bob and Diane made. So let's take you know, the neighborhood between Forest Drive and Hilltop, and say somebody happens to manage to buy 4 adjacent lots. Because I don't know, maybe there's 4 families there that are all elderly and they all want to leave Annapolis and go to Florida or something. And somebody manages to buy 4 lots. They're all adjacent. The options there would be to develop them, you know, by one person that has 4 separate, say, 4plexes on those lots that are, you know, basically this missing middle. Or if they were allowed, they could consolidate those 4 lots into one and then build something really big, because you'd meet all of these zoning requirements. I guess part of my question is there anything that would force them to sort of stick to this like 4 separate 4plex topology? Or can they by right just say, I want to make this one big lot and then go, you know, just max it out, that, you know, in terms of height, et cetera, that might not sort of fit the character. And then all of a sudden now you've got something that most people probably wouldn't object to, like 4 4plexes in, you know, on these 4 separate lots, versus all of a sudden now a big apartment building amongst a bunch of bungalows that people
Right.
no doubt would object to. Is that something that, you know, the planning and zoning could say, no, we're not going to let you consolidate these lots? I don't know what the by rightness is there.
Well, I guess that would bring us back to the financial dynamic on that. Even the properties along Tyler Avenue, the properties that are like 50 by 400 feet deep are valued currently at like $600,000 or $700,000. So if somebody was going to buy up 4 of those single family dwellings, and then they have, you know, they've already got over $2 million into property acquisition to do that. I think it would be very difficult for them to build workforce housing, even with the financial mechanics of it wouldn't work. That property is already worth more than it would be to make that
Well, I mean, so
scenario work.
let's take that particular. I don't mean to zoom in on a particular place, but
But
let's
Bob,
just say,
okay.
let's just say, you know, my hypothetical of, can the city say, no, you can't consolidate these lots, you have to sort of develop them separately?
No,
And they'd have
No.
to go through a replatting process,
right.
subdivision process that would add a lot of time. But yeah, I mean, they could go through.
But they also will have to meet, there are other requirements that you would have to meet to do all of that. It's not like we're getting rid of all the requirements. I mean, you still have to meet stormwater management requirements. You have to meet, if you have more than 40,000 square feet of land area, you have to meet forest conservation requirements, which means in case for those lots probably means that you have to do afforestation. There are other, you know, it's not just a given that you're going to be able. I think going back to the financial dynamics, if you look at all the factors that are involved, you know, in what it costs to build anything, I don't think that that's probably a realistic scenario. But I do think that, you know, so that's just my opinion on that. And perhaps when we get to testimony from our affordable housing people, they can give you more insight into that.
Okay. So I didn't mean to cut you off, Diane. Do you still have some line of questioning to go?
Well, I guess I was wondering, Eric, could you talk about the Choice Neighborhood Initiative and how this would impact that?
Well, that area is already R4 zoning, so it really wouldn't change that project at all. And we're already required by the, this is the HUD Choice Neighborhood Initiative project that the city is doing, working on with the Housing Authority right now, which is a redevelopment project for the Eastport Terrace and Harbor House communities, which is the largest public housing communities in the city. It's at 30 acres. And so, you know, the requirements of that program are that we have to preserve the affordable housing as it is today, but then add additional housing units as well, and with the goal of making it a mixed income community. So the requirements of that program are all pretty stringent already, and we're kind of already bound to, you know, meeting the requirements of that program to be in contention for, you know, a lot of financing from HUD. So, sorry, all that to say that this really would not have an impact on that project. But perhaps in the neighborhood, there are properties adjacent that might be, there are certainly affordable housing properties in that neighborhood that might be, you know, benefit from this, but I can't really speak anything specific.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have for right now.
Okay, who's next? Have questions? Teresa or Ben? Do you have any particular questions?
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I think we've covered most of it, particularly, I have a residence in Tyler Avenue on one of the larger properties, so delving into that a little bit deeper helped me put some perspective on what's being proposed. So thank you. Help
Ben, do you have any
visualize, right?
questions?
You look at scenarios, I'm like, oh, okay, I get that.
Well, I have a couple of specific questions. Well, while we're on scenarios, let me ask what your thoughts would be around the project that we reviewed that MRE is doing in West Annapolis on Giddings Avenue between Ridgely and oh, hey, David. Giddings Avenue between Ridgely and Annapolis Street. You know, the four townhouses that they built for rental. And, you know, setting aside, I don't know what their investment is in the property, et cetera, but, you know, that could have been, is it fair to say that could, instead of 4 units, which, you know, as it's being built, to me now seems like not enough units for that space. You know, I think it might have been nicer. They might have been able to put double the number of units there because they wouldn't have had to take up so much room with that parking lot with the required parking. Is that a fair statement? That they might have been able to make that pencil?
They might have been. It's really hard to know without knowing what they paid for the land and their profit.
But I mean, just in terms of the,
Yeah.
you know, the physical characteristics of the land, you know, I don't know the economics of it, but the physical characteristics of the land.
I do think that there would have been some potential there. I mean,
Yeah.
because it's, again, this is, if say they were to build, you know, twice the number of units or more, a bit more than that. I mean, only, you know, 60% of them would be priced for the income thresholds, and then they could have, you know, had other units that were priced higher. So yeah, I mean, it probably could have penciled, I think. And it, you know, you have a developer who's investing in the neighborhood there, who has some skin in the game, I guess, in terms of what happens to that neighborhood. You know, maybe make some decisions just that are aimed at just bringing in certain people that can't live in that neighborhood today. So who knows? But
Yeah, I mean, and the reason I ask is that, you know, as they purchase more properties, I could see their, especially if they're rentals, I could see they're wanting to have, you know, sort of a more diversified sort of income stream at all different price points, et cetera, you know, just to diversify their their investment. So I mean, I would love to see something like that come into West Annapolis personally.
Well, Alex, I
So-
think that, in our many discussions that we had with affordable housing advocates, certainly, that, we all believed that if we could create legislation that, that had a lot of flexibility to it, we could hopefully attract more developers to do affordable housing, workforce housing in the city, because we're creating this, this package of that gives them a lot of flexibility. And that
Yeah.
was that, exactly what you said, that we'd have something to offer them. We don't, right now, we have nothing to offer them except, hurdles that they
Yeah.
can't meet.
Okay, so two other really specific things in the set of recommendations. You have the sections, the deletions on line 85 and 91 that sort of remove that specific language about certification, blah blah blah. And I flagged those as why were you deleting those, but I think I may have answered my question, because later down in the line 120, where it basically talks about what Bob mentioned, where the planning and zoning director sort of sets those standards based on, advertising and how we promulgate rules. It basically, that's these line 85 and 91 are sort of redundant, specifically redundant to what you suggest to add in line 120. Is that the way to read that?
That's correct. And all of these amendments were amendments that we discussed with HHW and with the Affordable Housing and Community Equity Commission. I hope I got all the words in there that time. And everybody agreed to these amendments. So those types of changes where we deleted this and substituted that were something that, that was all a strategy.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that
Yeah,
that's
you're
the way I was
absolutely
reading that,
correct.
and that was the intent.
Yes.
I mean, it reads that way, but I just want to make sure that was the intent. And then the last one I had was under the rules for open space in your suggestions on common open space.
Mhm.
In the letter D, where they talk about open space, should be public ownership covered by an open space easement. That's pretty well understood how that works. But the next piece, controlled by homeowners association or property management company. I know we actually, I remember hearing that talked about. I don't know whether it was at that committee hearing or whether we've discussed that kind of in relationship to the Willows. But the question I have is like, what prevents a property management company who has a fitness center from saying, I don't want that to be a fitness center. I want to use it to store my boss's car, for example. I mean, that's a ridiculous example, but to basically remove it from being public space and turning it into something that's not public space. What prevents that?
Well, because we would also have, included as part of the covenants for the property. If you look at the next one's, provision shall be made for the ownership, conservation, and maintenance of the common open space. So with all common open space, we include restrictions on how it can be used, and, it can be used. The property management company thing was hotly debated among all of the people that participated in this, but was felt that it was necessary to have that because, one of the types, a lot of this will be rental housing. So, but it would,
So where's a covenant like that written, that if
It
the
gets
property
recorded in the
management
land
company did
records.
that, a resident could say, here, look here, you can't do that.
Well, can't do what?
Well, I mean, if they took the fitness center away and, made it into storage, for example.
Well, it would be in the covenants what the common open space was going to be used for. And you usually with covenants, then you do create a process to allow the change to common open space. And we've seen that in many communities. I mean, where you know, they had a tennis court and they got rid of it and they replaced it with some other kind of thing, over time. And the community made that decision under, as
Yeah, I mean,
as a
I
whole.
think that's pretty clear when there's a homeowners association that's
Mhm.
sort of run by residents, but if it's, a thing that's, a complex that might be entirely run by a property management company, what prevents them from being sort of dictatorial like that? That's
Well, even with a rental property where you've consolidated all the property onto one lot and you've recorded a new plat and the plat has restrictions on it, and you can have conditions on that plat that say identify things like this is the common open space and tell what it's used for. I mean, you can put plat restrictions on that.
okay. I just wanted to make sure that
Right.
there's a place that gets recorded, because institutional, especially over the time frame of these things, institutional knowledge is lost as people retire, and if it's
Mhm.
not written down in a place
needs to
that's sort
be-
of
right.
immutable, that stuff goes away. And
You're
that's the
absolutely
problem,
correct,
probably.
Alex, and we've learned that lesson the hard
That's
way
why I'm
over
bringing.
and
That's
over
why I'm
again.
bringing it up.
Yeah, Tom and I talk about it all the time with certain things, that it needs to be on the plat.
Okay.
If you're gonna restrict something, it needs to be on the plat. It can't be in some random document that
Yeah.
nobody can find.
Exactly. Okay. Well, those were the questions that I had. I think does anybody else have any? So David, you've come in. I don't know how much you've heard. Do you have anything that jumps out at you at this point?
No, not really. I came in a little bit late, but I think you guys made some really good points. So I'm pretty satisfied at this point that I don't really have anything new. I'm afraid I might be repeating things that have already been said. So I'm good.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Well, I think if at this point, if we don't have any more detailed questions about the legislation or the staff report, and so one last opportunity from the commissioners.
No, we're good.
Okay, so at this point, I think the thing to do is to open the public hearing, and let's hear from any of the folks that may have come on to testify. To supplement the four things that we were received in writing, or if anybody has not submitted something in writing is going to testify. So I declare the public hearing now open, and
Alex, we have several of the alderpersons here.
Yes.
You might, as a courtesy, you might ask them if they want to speak first or last.
Yes, thank you for that reminder. And I wasn't sure who wanted to actually make some comments, but let's extend that courtesy to the three alderpersons on the call here to chime in.
No, I came to listen.
Okay.
I was looking forward to Eric's presentation and also the public testimony that's coming up.
Okay, great.
Thank you, though.
Ross, do you have something to say?
Well, I came to listen, and now I'm sorry that I did. I'm greatly confused because I seem to be hearing from the staff, well, this isn't really likely to happen anyplace. And so my question is, if it's not likely to happen, why are we messing around with the R1 to R3 zones? Why are we messing around with the B zones? Sounds like this can only happen in large parcels that are cheap. And so it seems like we're making an enormous amount of code change. And I was hoping to get some clarity on that, but quite frankly, I haven't, and probably won't get until we get to the rules committee. But I have to say, I feel like a rube at a carnival, and I have all these people saying, oh yeah, try it. Nothing bad's going to happen. Just put your money down. we're going to make this all happen. It's not really going to happen in your neighborhood. And yet the legislation is changing my neighborhood. So I have a lot more to learn. So I will keep my peace and see what develops from the public testimony and then when it gets to rules.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure you will have your plenty opportunity when it comes to the full city council for debate, no doubt. Alderman Gay, I'm sure you want to chime in. No doubt.
I'll actually save my comments for the end.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I think that's the three other persons are there's nobody else. I have my view here set to only people who have the camera on, so let's see. Okay. All right, well, let's go to hearing from the public.
Who is speaking on behalf of the Community Development Committee? Is that Nancy? Is that you or is it Teresa?
There's actually 3 people on right now. Would you like me to just bring that whole commission forward?
Yes, that would be great.
Yeah, Nancy Lipson, Patrick Sheridan, and Terry Bond are all here.
So they can, which one of you would like to, they are all, the 3 of them are on our Community Development Committee, and I think, do you all have a preference about what order you speak in? Nancy, Terry?
I think Nancy should go first, as
Okay.
she's our chair.
Agreed.
Is Nancy with us? She had emailed me that she got kicked out, and I sent to Julian, I sent you an email about getting her back on.
I am
This seems
back.
on. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, there she is.
Yeah. So you want me to start?
Yep.
Okay. My name is Nancy Libson, and I'm here today on behalf of the Affordable Housing and Community Development Equity Commission. That's the long name. In support of the proposed city ordinance 4020-22. Prior to my retirement 9 years ago, I had spent more than 40 years working on various aspects of affordable housing, including development, financing, legislation, policy, public housing, and technical assistance at the federal, state, and local levels. My experience and my participation in the city's Housing Affordability Task Force and the AHCDEC confirm the advisability of creating a workforce housing program like that proposed in O-40-22. As well, the city's 5-year consolidated plan and the needs assessments included in the task force final report recommended the development of housing for the missing middle. Those with incomes up to 120% of area median income. That housing could include duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes, in addition to larger scale rental communities. There was a lot of talk about tax credit housing, and yes, this could have tax credit housing in it, but it also, and maybe more importantly, is kind of focused on smaller development, single family home ownership properties rather than big multifamily housing. By way of background, AHCDEC, whose charge is in part to study and advise the City Council on strategies to improve and increase housing for underserved populations, was tasked with considering the creation of workforce housing legislation as a result of the HACA consent decree. The decree required the city to review and consider the affordable and workforce housing legislation passed by Anne Arundel County. Ordinance 4022 largely mirrors the county legislation, except that it reflects the differing zoning requirements and land availability between the city and the county. It provides both zoning and cost flexibility to encourage the development of housing for low and moderate income families in Annapolis for the missing middle. It's worth noting that the proposed ordinance is in keeping with the trends in zoning and housing policy, both in the Baltimore-Washington region and nationally. In closing, I thank you for your attention. And I urge you to favorably recommend proposed ordinance 4022 to create a workforce housing program for Annapolis and its residents.
Mr. Klein, could I ask Ms. Lipson a question?
Yes, please do.
Ms. Lipson, thank you for all the work that you've done, and it's good work. But I
It's
want to
a
question.
long time. I get
Uh-huh.
that. It's been a long time.
It took a long time, but it's may have been worth it. I do have one question. You said that you feel that this legislation is pointed more towards the smaller kinds of developments, the duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes.
Right.
And yet other people have said tonight that they think that it's going to have relevance only to larger parcels of property. Could you expand on why you think this contradiction or contrast exists?
One is just simply land availability. There is not a lot of land on which to build in the city. If we were in the county, that'd be a different story, but it's the city and there's just not a lot of land available, and that which does exist is expensive, as we've discussed a lot. So I think it's really more focused on trying to get those smaller scale duplexes, triplexes, and quadruplexes, which could be both, could be either rental or ownership, rather than the big projects. Will there be big projects? Potentially, but I firmly convinced that we're really trying to focus on those smaller, more of those projects that will fit within the construct of various communities and be compatible with various communities in the city.
Do you forecast that applications pursuant to this new legislation would be tax credit supported, or would they be
only the big projects? Yes.
That's
mostly that's about the only sort. That's one of the few sources of financing for multifamily housing. The smaller projects, I doubt that those will be tax credit. Tax credits are very expensive to develop with all the fees and the bond underwriting and everything else that goes along with it. So the smaller projects are going to be a much different ball of wax.
Okay. What kinds of projects do you foresee taking advantage of this?
Well, I think it would be a developer who could take several lots or renovate single family houses that need to be renovated. I just don't foresee, it'll be smaller scale. And those people who don't want to go through the aggravation of a huge tax credit project, but could, if they could get the numbers to work, would be interested in doing something for the smaller scale, on a smaller scale.
So because I like examples, would you see something like a renovated single family house that was made into 3 units where 60% would be 2 of the units? So maybe
Possibly.
the nicest unit would be market rate and the two smaller units would be for the 80 to 120% AMI. Is that the kind of scenario you're envisioning?
Yeah, but I don't think that we would want to focus on, or to make it possible to look at a building and look at the units and say, oh, that's for the lower income person. I think we'd want to make them all pretty compatible. There might be extra amenities that would go into I keep getting kicked out of my out of the system, so that's why
You've been consistent.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I got a quick question for Alex.
I can't see.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Ms. Lipson, I've been wondering if we don't have the missing middle here, and we're only an 8 square mile small community, really a small city. You would think it'd be right outside of our city limits in the county. And if you're saying there's legislation there that may favor it, why isn't it there? And also, where is the missing middle type of housing? Where is it referenced to around our city?
Well, I think the county does have some projects that they've done under their statute. Mostly they've been tax credit projects. Teresa may know better the number of projects they've done, but they haven't done a lot. It's only been, I think this legislation's only been around for a year and a half or something like that.
And you would think there would be some with the cheaper land prices out in the county, just outside of the city limits, maybe a mile or so out there, and, public busing. Yeah, I know that's further from our city. It's not exactly the solution, but you would think there would be some out there. What's stopping it?
I don't know that it is being stopped necessarily outside the city limits.
Not stopping, but why isn't it there already? You would think there would be some, since we have such a problem here. There would be a need.
I can't answer that question.
Okay.
Ben, the county legislation is not very old.
No, I think it's only a year older.
Huh?
I think it's only a year and a half old.
Yeah, so it may.
But even without the legislation, you would think, I mean, I'm not the expert on this, but you would think there'd be an economic reason to actually build some middle income type housing further out where the property's cheaper. And if it's just not happening, why is that? Do we have to go really far? I mean, you have to go to Crownsville to get cheap enough property to make it happen? I'm just wondering what would happen.
Probably.
Okay. I don't think those properties are actually that cheap.
Yeah, I was going to say, even then, I think Crownsville is probably not very cheap either.
I mean, the stuff that's happening generally in the county is larger scale, and it's in, areas like along Route 2, for example.
Yeah, we get a big apartment complex with no green space for the tenants right by the Double T Diner at Route 2 and by the hospital. Okay.
Okay, well,
the county has one project under development under its workforce housing that I think is starting to move forward, and it's located in Odenton.
Odenton.
And I think their legislation is actually like 3 years old.
That doesn't do us any good.
Right.
No.
Okay, well, thanks very much. Who's the next person that wants to speak?
Is Pat here?
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Hey, you go ahead.
Great,
yeah, I'm Patrick Sheridan. I'm also one of the members of the commission, along with Teresa and Nancy. I also have a couple other roles too. I'm on the City of Annapolis Housing Authorities board, also as a commissioner, and also in this role, actually kind of representing our new nonprofit subsidiary, which is the Annapolis Housing and Community Development Corporation, as the president of that organization. And the reason the organization was formed as a nonprofit was to be able to allow the housing authority to have some additional options in partnering with other developers and other organizations on providing housing besides just public housing. And, a lot of the concepts with what we're trying to do with housing authorities, of course, is give people a hand up and be able to move on to, more traditional types of housing, and without having, this continuum of housing between public housing, affordable housing, meaning 60% area median income and less, and then the missing middle housing that we're talking about. There's just no way for many of them to move up. I totally agree with what Nancy was talking about from the standpoint that you won't see a lot of large developments done with this program, mainly because of the lack of available land. It's extremely expensive to assemble properties. Part of my last 18 years before retirement was operating the housing department for a large national nonprofit organization that worked nationally. And we did a lot of small developments that were permanent supportive housing and such, along with the affordable housing developments that we did. But It was always sort of a holy grail, if you will, to try to be able to provide housing for people that need more than 60% area median income. Because we just were finding in many communities that we worked in that had similar demographics as Annapolis, that people on that 60% and above that didn't have the opportunity to utilize some of the federal or state affordable housing programs really lacked the opportunity to either buy a house or to even afford rentals. I think that this will allow that to happen. You know, certainly even under the federal housing, federal low-income housing tax program, recently the IRS changed some of the regulations to allow the new program to be utilized that will allow them to go up to 80% AMI, so long as they blend it with lower income units. And, you know, as such, I think there may be some tax credit developments that are put together that might be on larger parcels that could take advantage of this also, to be able to reach people at 60% area median income up to 80%. But I think that, you know, I don't want people to forget that you can use this program to also do home ownership properties. So, you know, a development of 10 townhouses that might be put together on, you know, 3 adjoining lots or something along that line could have a percentage of those units be sold as affordable workforce as opposed to market rate, with the balance being market rate housing. So I think that what this legislation will do is just give people more options to be able to hit that sweet spot of above 60% area median income, and yet below what the market rate costs are to be able to either buy or rent in the community.
What are the incentives built into this for a developer to do that?
I think it's the opportunity to provide or put a few more units on a parcel. I think the Tyler Avenue example is probably a good one, in that, you know, there are some larger lots there with just a single family home on it that could support more than one unit. There's not a lot of places in the city like that, unless you were to take an existing building and take it from a single family residence into a multifamily. But I think where there are opportunities, such as on Tyler Avenue or some other parcels, if you can add a few additional more units that would be eligible for workforce housing, I think that's a very positive step.
And I have a question about this. It's really about how the low income tax credits work. If you'll entertain a question about that.
Sure.
Say there were a developer that had some rental units that were, you know, high market rates, and maybe they had a number of properties around the city that were rental units. Those low income tax credits help defer tax liability on those market rate ones if they build, you know, say another development that's all, for example, all done with those low income tax credits. So it's not, is my understanding correct that it's not just about the one developer you're making, but it's basically the credits that you get help offset tax liability on something that's market rate, even though they're separate developments? Am I reading that the right way?
Not quite. It's actually a program where federal government allocates tax credits to the state housing agency. In the case of Maryland, that's Community Development Administration, which then, in essence, selects projects which they award the credits to. The developer sells those credits to an institutional investor, more or less, and these are almost exclusively commercial banks, Chase, JP Morgan, you know, the banks of America. And what they're doing is buying those credits in order to meet, in many cases, Community Reinvestment Act requirements that they have if they operate in that area. The developer in turn takes that capital investment by the tax credit investor and uses it to reduce the amount of hard debt that they have to have on the property, which in turn allows them to reduce the rents that they charge at those properties. So the tax benefit actually flows to the financial institutions, but quite frankly, they do it as much for the Community Reinvestment Act credit as they do for the tax benefit.
Okay, thanks.
That's interesting.
Clearly, high finance is not my wheelhouse. Anybody else have questions for Mr. Sheridan?
No.
All right, great. Well, thank you very much.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question?
Sure.
It's Ellie. Hi, Patrick, Mr. Sheridan. I'm really intrigued about your last couple of sentences there as far as going back to the banks. And could you give me your opinion on what does workforce housing look like from the perspective of the banks on a federal level? Is this an appealing investment for them? Because that's, I'm trying to follow the money here. And
yeah, I think as Nancy mentioned, the smaller properties are not going to use tax credits. It's just much too complicated a program. The investors don't want to take the time to underwrite a small project. I'd say the average tax credit investor would not invest in a property smaller than roughly 30 units. So again, I don't see that happening very often, but they are interested in investing in some of these, though, that are the kind of the mixed income tax credit where you can go up to 80% AMI. So again, so long as they're large enough properties that there's a significant investment there.
okay, I was trying to find the sweet spot there, but yeah, thank you.
So for the smaller guy, for the smaller property though, 2, 3, 4 units, the advantage is the density that they're able to provide and the fact that they're paying half the amount of licensing and permitting fees.
I believe so.
And that they can move through the system faster.
Correct.
Okay. All right. Good. Thank you very much. This is, a useful lesson in the way things actually work.
All right, thank you very much. And who's next?
I'm Terry Bond. I'm
Okay.
also on the commission. I'm not going to talk a lot because a lot's been said already. I just want to I'm not going to read my comments that I submitted. You can all read them. But I think I really do want to say that when we created this, we were looking to find opportunities for new development, and it's more infill. I know there's been a lot of talk about the large projects, and there are few now are coming forward, but we didn't expect a lot of that. So we were looking at more smaller projects, infill, attached single family housing, and not having things plop down in neighborhoods as was mentioned earlier by the alderman. It's to have compatible new infill development. If there need to be guidelines created for that kind of development and established neighborhoods, that can be added. That can be added by staff. It doesn't necessarily have to be part of the legislation. But that's a lot of the housing across the country, what they're doing in single family neighborhoods is trying to get the small infill projects. And like you said, West Annapolis is a prime example. That development on the corner, it could have been so much better if there was some more flexibility in how they developed it. And this could have helped that. So I just want to say in closing, I do want to finish up with the comments that I had, that I'm really proud that we're trying to do something here in Annapolis, that the city's moving forward. We're at the cutting edge, which is great. And keeping the mix of housing that we have and the mix of people and keeping that diversity alive is so important. I've lived in this city off and on since the late 70s. And I think it's a wonderful city, but we're losing some of that now because of the cost of housing and the inability of people to stay. So I think it's important that we do something with this legislation. I also want to thank our past chairperson, Kathy Ebner, who helped create this legislation, as well as staff for working to keep it simple, as they say, to use existing legislation and not create a lot of new requirements. So I look for your support and hope that you'll support this legislation, or at least some form of it, to get us moving in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as we've talked about, really the thing that I think is all on our minds is, in practice, what will the incentives be, and how will this actually manifest itself? So that, I guess that's an open question. And I think many of us would agree that having this work towards infill development is really the goal. I mean, certainly that's my opinion. I would love to see a little bit more thickening of places where it's appropriate. My neighborhood included. I live in West Annapolis. I would love to see more of that. But anyway, so let's see. Is there Julian? Is there anybody else online to speak?
Yeah, we have one a member from the committee, Mr.
Okay.
Evan Pickett.
Okay, let's okay, go ahead, Mr. Pickett.
My name is Evan Pickett, and I'm an associate with Cats Day LLC. This firm represents a variety of clients with regard to land use and development matters within the city of Annapolis and throughout Anne Arundel County, Maryland. We speak in support of Bill O-4022 as it creates needed flexibility for housing types and densities in a local real estate market that is continuously changing and evolving. The Annapolis City Zoning Code is a living, breathing document that needs to evolve with the marketplace. The latest iteration of the code was adopted in 2005. Since that time, the Annapolis housing market has experienced many cycles, both up and down. However, I believe we can all agree that the market today is materially different than the market that existed in 2005 when the code was adopted. As a result, it is the city's obligation to continuously make adjustments in order to adequately address and serve the housing needs of its residents and workforce. The affordable housing crisis is a headline we are all familiar with. It is now national news and not unique only to the city of Annapolis. More importantly, the COVID-19 pandemic, 40-year high inflation, and historically high interest rates have further exacerbated the housing crisis in America and our local market. Home prices have skyrocketed, rents have continued to climb, and income has remained relatively stagnant. The combination of these factors have made it more and more difficult for working class families to be able to escape the cycle of renting and begin building equity in a home. By every measure, homeownership is an essential element to the pursuit of the American dream and the ability to build true wealth in this country. Access to the ownership of assets is critical. The effects of the imbalance of supply and demand are clearly being felt in the city. In addition to the skyrocketing housing prices, rents have also continued to climb as a result of lack of supply. According to CoStar's most recent multifamily submarket report, it has been more than 4 years since a property of at least 25 units opened its doors in Annapolis. That has provided ample time for units to lease up, which has allowed for the submarket's vacancy rate to compress to 4.2%. Furthermore, with limited supply side pressures over the next 4 quarters, fluctuations in that rate will only come from the demand side of things. Given the aforementioned vacancy compression that has taken place in Annapolis since the beginning of last year, pricing power has remained in the hands of property managers. By the end of last year, asking rents grew by 13.4%, and the city is experiencing a negative absorption rate. Demographic detail report showing the 2022 population by occupation reflects that the large majority, 39.38% of the population, falls into the professional and management sector, while every other sector is highly fragmented. This high concentration of professional and management workers indicates that the great majority of the men and women who serve us in our community simply do not live in the city. Instead, they are forced to commute, in some instances, great distances to work, which further strains the household income as gas prices and car maintenance and repairs amount. The time to address this crisis is now. Even with legislation such as this bill, it can take upwards of 5 years for builders to bring product to the market. Therefore, not only do we have a crisis currently facing the city of Annapolis, but if we fail to act now, the crisis will only continue to grow. Thank you for your consideration, and we echo the Office of Planning and Zoning support of Bill O-4022.
Thank you very much. Can you? It went by me too fast in the beginning. Which LLC you represent?
Cats Day. We're a law firm. We represent many developers within the county.
Okay.
Do you see any of your clients wanting to take advantage of this?
Yeah, absolutely. They're very excited about this legislation, and they're really hoping to see it enacted.
And which, sort of at what scale typically do you represent clients at? You know, the sort of a larger scale, a smaller scale?
We have a lot of larger scale, but we also do work with several affordable housing developers, and they're really looking for a variety of opportunities. So larger scale projects, obviously, but I think as was mentioned this evening, there are maybe some opportunities that open up that are on the smaller scale that pencil and make sense. And development in this county is particularly difficult, and in the city particularly difficult. So anything that really opens the door for some more development is going to be attractive to our clients.
Okay, great. And any questions from Mr. Pickett?
Alex, I believe that Mr. Pickett's firm represents the developer that's looking at has the WNAV site. Isn't that correct, Mr. Pickett?
And Jackie, you're taking the words out of my mouth.
I just think that, he's speaking in generalities, but there is a specific project that we understand, would that this legislation would allow to move forward.
Yeah, thanks. That context is
I
always
think that's
important.
helpful to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I'm here tonight speaking on behalf of our partner, David Katz. I'm not familiar with that project, but I'm sure I'm sure you're correct about that.
Okay, thanks very much. So I think that's it from the public, and I think the last person that I think he wanted to go last was Alderman Gay.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I first want to obviously give thanks to the Housing Affordability Task Force. We started meeting in April of 2020 at the height of the pandemic, and we worked through the pandemic in virtual meetings, split into 4 subcommittees. And we finished work about a year and a half later and compiled some documents that I'm extremely proud of. And our main focus was making sure that those documents could come to life, and the 10 recommendations that we put forward could come to life. And as of current, we're working on 8 of 10 of those recommendations, whether they be in the draft phase with the Office of Law, current legislation, or policies that have been changed. So I'm extremely proud of that task force, as well as the Housing and Community Equity Development Commission that I at one point had an opportunity to chair, but then it was taken over by Kathy Ebner, who did a fantastic job, and Nancy Lipson and the entire crew that spoke this afternoon. So I'm proud of that work, and I would encourage the commission to support this project. I think the last speaker did a fantastic job of breaking down the statistics of the housing crisis that we're currently in the city of Annapolis. It's become unbearable for a working family to live in the city of Annapolis. And I think that has a lot to do with policies enacted by previous councils and commissions. And to be blatant, some of those policies were enacted because due to just blatant classism and the desire and the need to ensure that only the elite and wealthy could live in the city of Annapolis. And that's created significant amount of problems. More specific to the legislation, I look forward to the benefits of this legislation, and particularly the lease to own option, which would create housing ownership in the city of Annapolis, which is hard to come by even through the MPDU program that the city currently has. I look forward to the opportunity to expand the verbiage to include the missing middle housing, which has been a focus of the Housing and Human Welfare Committee, since I've kind of got taken over as chair and had the assistance of my colleagues, Alderwoman Tierney and Alderman Shandelmeyer. And I look forward to the large projects as well. I'm not sure where the fear of scale or community character comes from. The city of Annapolis has a tradition of including multifamily dwelling units in the mix of single family zoned communities. We've seen images tonight that show that, and there are communities in both Ward 8, 1, 6, 5 that have a mixed use zoning pattern. What is the difference between a President's Point and a development that could be proposed through this legislation at the WNAV site, the Willows, which is a smaller project, or any other proposed projects in the city of Annapolis? I think the fear is, as mentioned, due to classism and due to a need to continue to oppress those seeking to achieve a home ownership status and even rental status in the city of Annapolis. It's difficult when you have constituents come to you and complain about 25% increases just in this year to their rents, and them having to ration food, gas, and other accessories just to live in the city of Annapolis. To live in the city that they grew up in, that shouldn't be, a golden prize. Oh, I get to keep my apartment complex in Annapolis. They want to stay here because they've had family roots here. They've grown up in these communities, generations of families. And part of the reason that we're continuing the fight for affordable housing is because their generation went through the same housing crisis we're going through. And so I urge the committee to really take into consideration the work that the staff has done, that these committees have put into the projects, that the older people have put into these projects. As mentioned, we're taking this crisis seriously. And a housing crisis is just as serious as a health crisis. I think the last thing the city of Annapolis wants is families all over the streets because they can't afford to live here. And so I would urge you all to support the legislation. We're open to amendments and working out through the rules and city government process as well. And so this is not a perfect document, but we definitely urge the passage of this document.
Well, thanks, Alderman Gay. It looks like you may not get the last word unless you want to rebuttal, because I see Alderman Schandelmeyer is here and you would like to speak. So take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although Alderman Gay, no worries. I don't think I'm going to say anything you're going to want to rebut. First of all, I apologize. I had to sign off. Something came up that required my full attention. Back on now. Heard there's possibly some issues brought up with community character. Look, I don't know when a lot of you folks were able to buy your house, but the real estate market right now, whether it's rentals or purchasing in not just Annapolis, but all of Central Maryland, is apocalyptically bad unless you came in with wealth. I was fortunate enough to be able to purchase a home of my own along with my wife, Chelsea, at the beginning of the year. And we were forced into this because our landlord was upping our rent by about $400 because that's what the market could support. And they are able to do that due to the chronic underbuilding of housing. And frankly, the only reason we were able to afford this house with two people with good paying jobs, two decent paying jobs each, was because we didn't have to pay our student loans for the throughout of the pandemic. And for our wedding, we essentially crowdfunded our down payment, as we don't want stuff just give us money so we can start a family. That is how bad it is. And we were only barely able to get our foot in the door after months of fighting with other people able to outbid us because they came in with more capital. It was very telling for the longest time that the two youngest alderpersons could not afford to buy a home in the city they represented. And the only reason the slightly older of the two was able to was, again, crowdfunding. That's a dystopia.
I'm laughing because that's quite an extreme word and it might apply.
Thank you. It is an extreme word and it is chosen very deliberately. We won't solve everything with this bill, but this is a positive step towards shifting the city of Annapolis's idea of community character from how many people we can exclude to how many people that grew up here that want to come here we can welcome. Because that is the type of city that I want to live in. That is the type of city that my colleague Alderman Gay, my colleague Alderwoman Tierney want to live in. And if we do not pass this, we are essentially saying we want our city to be about excluding our police, our firefighters, our teachers, our librarians, our city workers, and so many other people who bring so much positivity and goodness to this place that we are going to drive out due to a fear of change. And folks, we can't keep doing that if we're going to thrive in the upcoming decades. So, just like my colleague, I urge you, please pass this. Our real estate market is so broken for young families like mine, for young families like Alderman Gay, for families that are retiring, for families that have something change because of an unemployment or sickness. And those little slips that can happen to any of us are pushing people out of the city that we love. So support this, give it a favorable recommendation. Thank you for your time.
Alex, can I?
Yep, sure.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this is public. It's kind of a testimony plus a question there. I have this challenge with our mayor that I can't get affordable housing in Ward 1. He thinks it's sort of an oxymoron that how can I possibly get affordable housing in Ward 1? He is correct. Since we're telling personal stories, I mean, the salary of a council person. So you would say we're a one income family. And after we sold our last property, the only affordable housing, I had to live within Ward 1. And the only affordable housing was a condo at Park Place. I mean, that's pretty bad when the alderperson can't afford to live in her own ward, without making some big financial decision. So that really hit me hard. And so the problem that I have specific to Ward 1 is some of these efforts, like the accessory dwelling unit, because of our because there's such an appeal downtown, for these investment properties, that anything we do, like if it's an accessory dwelling unit or if we increase density, I'm afraid they're going to be bought up for this whole short-term rental thing. I'm serious when I say that the short-term rentals have really deteriorated the housing in the available housing inventory in downtown, as well as elevated the cost of the houses. So we are where we are. I really believe that has made a major impact in the affordability of downtown. But to stop the bleeding, if this is passed, here's my question. I look at King George Street, with the row of specifically the blocks adjacent to East Street, King George, across from the Academy, there are these row houses kind of thing. Would being under the conservation district prevent me from making those into duplexes? I mean, would I be restricted by the conservation district? I can't play with those. Brooks is shaking his head. What do you?
No, you
It's
can't.
a Jackie question, I guess.
Well, a duplex is a permitted use. I think it's either permitted or special exception use already in the C1 district, Ellie.
Okay. And then as far as historic review, they don't dictate frontage dividing or anything like that.
We would
right?
have to, you would be amazed at how many more than single family dwellings we have already in the historic district. If we did an analysis, we did one years ago. But I mean, that's certainly, there would be, I can't say that could occur for every property, but there are certainly some properties in that area that probably could do what you're talking about.
Okay. And then as far as tax credits and stuff like that, the upper floors of Main Street, if those were, how do I get those to be workforce housing?
I don't think that's within the, I don't think tax credits, I don't think there's a program right now, Teresa may know this, that would allow for that kind of tax credit housing for the upper floors along Main Street. There are so many other constraints about converting the upper floors of Main Street to residential, but we do encourage people to do that. We had a pre-app this week with someone who's renovating the Helly Hansen and the Musto buildings, and we talked about them adding residential upstairs, which was not part of their original program, and they had said they would look at that. So, you know,
Okay.
that's a case-by-case basis thing, I really think.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
All right, thanks. So is there anybody else that wants to make any comments?
Well, I think, I guess we're heading towards conclusion. I just wanted to sort of synopsize a couple of the things that at least I circled that maybe should be, could be worked on before we get back together in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, however many weeks.
Let's see if your list matches mine. Go for it.
Is to clarify what's going to be under site design review under 2122. Just that needs to be clarified as to what needs to be done. Whether all things will come before us. That may happen initially. 2 or 3 years from now, we may realize that we really don't need to look at somebody who's changing, putting more units into the same building or whatever. But I think we need to define and clarify what's going to be site design reviewed. Okay, that's number one. You're already working on the common open space definition. And I think that we've raised some problems or some potential issues with that. It just needs to be clarified as to what we mean by that and how we're going to protect those things. The issue of the parking, I'm not, if just what would happen if somebody began to put in parking, and if any parking would be required for units above a certain size, for instance, a certain number of units. I certainly don't see the need for parking for a 2 or 3 or 4 unit conversion. But what about larger than that? Is that an issue that, you should look at so that you don't overburden people, who currently live there? The third thing is to clarify, I think we need to clarify that projects built under this would have to abide by the current zoning regulations, meaning specifically conservation zones, which was part of Councilwoman Tierney's question. Permitted subject to standards needs to be clarified. So 1, 2, 3, 4 things. Is that, Eric, am I being clear?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, those are mostly what I wrote down, but I'm honestly not sure that we need 2 weeks to develop. I mean, I don't know what we'd be doing in the next 2 weeks. Like, I feel like there's clarity in what you just said, that those are the I mean, that's your recommendation right there. I don't know that we would be going back. I mean, others can chime in, but I'm not sure that we'd be going back and spending more time. Like, I feel like we could make some pretty clear determinations right now that those are the recommendations.
Why don't you guys come up with some very clear statements? It may be amendments to the legislation, it may be in the staff report, but it needs to be, I think these things need to be answered, and then we can move forward expeditiously. I think.
Yeah, I mean, this brings up a process question that I had is, I was looking back on my notes from a prior meeting when we were talking about the process for 04022. And I had in my note that we were only gonna have one public hearing. And, typically what we've been doing here is leaving it open to our next meeting, having another opportunity for anybody else to chime in based on what they heard here. We would close that, have our deliberations and vote at the second meeting. I assume that's our plan.
I didn't know that.
I mean, I assume because that's a typical process, but in reviewing my notes from a prior meeting, I had a note that there was only going to be one public hearing on this, and I mean, from staff,
Well, based
did
on
you
that
refresh
prior,
my memory? Did we talk about that, or?
based on that prior decision that you made, this was only advertised for this meeting to be heard at this meeting.
Oh, Jesus.
So.
Well, I mean,
because
that's fair. So we can close the public hearing, but
Right.
I don't think we're in a position. I mean, it's already 9:45. I don't think we're in a position to deliberate and vote tonight.
I think we've set a precedent about having a second meeting. I mean, it's not like we're having a second public hearing, which we just continue the public hearing another week is what we've
Yeah, I
been
mean,
doing.
I think and I'm going to speak for everybody here because I think you all agree that we're not in a position to close this out and vote tonight, and that would have to wait till our next meeting where we can have a more frank deliberation between ourselves. Do you all agree with that?
Yes, and
Yeah.
and perhaps
Yes.
one of us might get to work on findings and recommendations, but
Right.
I really would like some guidance on those 4 points from staff.
Yeah, and so if Eric, you can take those back and have some more clear language for us that would help us with our findings, that certainly will make our findings tighter rather than leaving something open-ended.
Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yeah.
You can correct me if I'm wrong. I believe by setting the precedent of operating under 2 public hearings, you were using the city manager's leverage of the state of emergency, which is expired. I don't believe you would have the authority. I'm serious. I do not believe you would have the authority to extend to a second public hearing. The city manager has made clear that the state of emergency has been lifted. And I believe the committee should be operating under its previous set of rules. If the city attorney could step in here or a director, that would be greatly appreciated.
Well, I didn't think it was a function of the
It's not a
emergency order. I think it was a function of
isn't.
our doing remote meetings.
Absolutely. It had nothing to do with the order.
Well, the
And-
remote
and I don't think
meetings
we ever
were
talked about it being a second public hearing. We just continued our public hearing. This
Yeah.
was not a
The rem-
second public hearing.
The remote
Doesn't have to
meetings were
do- It doesn't have
instituted.
to do with COVID. I mean,
It's nothing to
The
do with
remote,
COVID.
the
The
remote meetings were
reason,
brought forward
but
because of
Alderman Gay,
the
the reason we're doing remote meetings has nothing to do with COVID. It has to do with we decided it had to do with the unavailability of parking downtown to have people come downtown. I don't personally agree with that, but the commission voted that we should follow that, and that's why we're following that. It has nothing to do with COVID. or
You know,
emergency orders.
Alderman Gay, there was a very lorely argument. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
It was very.
Well, I
rules
think it
based.
stands, and I think the city attorney should make an opinion on it. I
Perhaps
think it's,
We can decide, we can run our meetings as we see fit to make them work well and be efficient. Now, if there's some kind of time constraint, let us know.
the time constraint is the housing crisis in the city of Annapolis, and I
Well,
desire to
weeks
get
isn't gonna change
the
it.
legislation to the
2
Rules and
weeks
City
isn't gonna
Government
change
Committee
it.
so that policymakers can be policymakers. That's the desire.
Well, the commission has to run itself so that it runs coherently, factually, and smoothly. And 2 weeks isn't going to change the crisis. I think you get a sense of where we're drifting. And we're only trying to make this legislation better so that it moves more smoothly through the council.
Yeah, I think a lot of these questions, if we can get them answered and buttoned up in our recommendation, they're less likely to get rehashed, when it comes to city council committees.
Right. If they get worked out now, it'll take less time later.
So as a compromise, perhaps we could agree, Eric and I will draft the 4 amendments that you've requested, and we can do that and have those to you, by Monday or Tuesday. I mean, they're not complicated amendments, and perhaps you all would consider assigning, the drafting of the findings to be circulated, so that perhaps at the December 1st meeting, we could move to a point where you would adopt a recommendation.
Yeah, and that's our plan, is by the end of the next meeting to be completely done with this.
Yes.
Right. I don't think
and let's be clear, you can close the public hearing and just postpone deliberations to the continued meeting. I'm not understanding what the problem is.
Well, I mean,
You don't necessarily
doesn't matter.
continue public hearing, close public hearing.
Yeah, I mean, if we leave the public hearing open until the next meeting, and I mean, my sense is nobody's gonna sign up to speak, but somebody else wants to speak, take a few minutes, and I don't think that really matters.
Well, I guess my point is, even if you did close a public hearing, there's no requirement that we deliberate, make a decision same day. That's my point. Is that we continue to the next meeting regardless.
Correct.
Yep.
Correct.
So, Alex, is someone going to volunteer to do the findings?
Yeah, do we have them volunteer? All right, Mr. Waldman, I think, has taken an active role here. But I'm happy to work those with you, Bob.
Eric and I commit.
Ms. Dorsey, would you, I will pass a draft by you for your editing. How's that sound?
Terrific.
I'd like to incorporate Ms. Rubio Dorsey.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So the sooner I get stuff, I'll start drafting, and the sooner I get stuff from Eric and from staff, the sooner that can be incorporated. It's unusual to circulate findings before a vote, but findings can always be changed in the course of a vote.
Yep.
Okay, Mr.
Yeah,
Gay?
I mean, I hope we all have a chance to look at this before we get together, and it will make that that last step in the process go very smoothly, I anticipate.
Okay.
Agreed.
Mr. Gay?
I'm not on the planning commission, so.
We're all working together here.
Of course, I agree.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
good.
So we'll leave the public hearing open until the next meeting, just in case there's a straggler that wants to have a say here. But as I said, we'll get this to ground at our next meeting. Okay. And I think at this point in our agenda, we are at the last item, which is adjournment. Well,
I move to adjourn.
Yeah, well, we have new business, but we have no new business. Unless anybody has
I will second.
for the goodness for the good of the order, but otherwise I'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
I think we already did it.
All right, second.
I already seconded.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to stay with us here till 10 o'clock.